Jameer, you breaking in my house? Like, are you serious? You breaking in my house, Jameer?
Why would I break in your house?
Why are you at my door with gloves on?
You be requiring yourself to sleep. You about to take this plea? Take it. Just know that he will never make it out of this.
How would you like somebody to do that to your mama or your sister? Huh?
This woman, Patrice Wilson, a 29-year-old registered nurse and devoted mother to her 7-year-old son, would be found dead in the trunk of her own vehicle, her body riddled with multiple gunshot wounds, discovered on Mother's Day in a parking lot 30 miles from where she'd last been seen alive. But what makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of how she died. It's the fact that she did everything right to get out of a toxic relationship, and yet the man who refused to accept her decision would be waiting for her in that parking lot, disguised and armed, ready to take everything from her. But before we get to how Patrice met her tragic end, let me take you back to where her path crossed with Jameer Michael Miller, a 36-year-old man from Inkster, Michigan, who would ultimately be convicted of her murder. Patrice wasn't just any nurse. She was described by colleagues and family as compassionate, hardworking, and deeply committed to her patients at Detroit Receiving Hospital, part of the Detroit Medical Center. She worked the grueling overnight shifts, serving patients in one of Detroit's busiest and most demanding healthcare environments. Born and raised in the Detroit area, she'd pursued nursing because she genuinely wanted to help people. Her mother, Rosalind Livingston, also worked for the Detroit Medical Center, and Patrice had followed in those footsteps. She was the kind of person who put everyone else first, her patients, her family, and especially her young son. But her personal life had become increasingly complicated because of her relationship with Jameer Miller. By early 2023, Patrice was actively trying to end things with him. Friends and family members would later tell investigators that the relationship had turned toxic. Miller was controlling, possessive, and most importantly, he refused to accept that it was over. Wayne County prosecutor Kim Worthy would later emphasize that this is the most dangerous period for victims of domestic violence, when they're trying to leave, when they're asserting their independence.
The defendant was a man that allegedly would not leave her alone, would not respond to her wishes to leave her alone.
And Miller fit that profile perfectly. He allegedly would not leave Patrice alone, would not respond to her repeated requests to be left alone. What makes this even more disturbing is that Miller wasn't some unknown quantity with a clean record. His criminal history dated back to 2007, a nearly 2-decade-long pattern of escalating violence and disregard for authority. We're talking about multiple convictions for weapons offenses, drug possession, assaulting and resisting a police officer, and fleeing from law enforcement. In 2007 alone, he was convicted of possessing narcotics, assaulting and resisting a police officer, and fleeing police in a vehicle. The following year, he was convicted of carrying a concealed weapon. By 2012, he'd added more weapons charges to his record, and in 2013, while already incarcerated, he was caught with contraband inside prison. But it wasn't just his official criminal record that should have raised alarms. In 2019, a woman in Saline, Michigan accused Miller of slashing her tires during what was described as a domestic dispute. Although no charges were filed because there weren't enough witnesses, the allegation fit a pattern. And then there's the most haunting connection of all. Miller was also linked to the 2011 disappearance of another ex-girlfriend, Bianca Chanel Green, a 24-year-old nursing student who vanished from Romulus, Michigan on March 25, 2011. Bianca was pregnant at the time of her disappearance, and she was the mother of Miller's young son. Her family would later reveal that she had been hiding from Miller for about a year before she disappeared because of his abusive behavior. She left behind her car, her belongings, and most importantly, her son. She sent one text to her family 2 days after she was last seen, and then nothing. Miller was questioned about Bianca's disappearance back in 2011, but was never charged. Investigators suspected foul play from the beginning because a pregnant nursing student and mother doesn't just abandon her child and disappear without a trace unless something terrible has happened. But without concrete evidence, without a body, the case went cold. So when Patrice Wilson entered into a relationship with this man, she was unknowingly involved with someone who had a documented history of violence, a pattern of controlling behavior toward women, and potential involvement in the disappearance of another partner.
Patrice Wilson, by all accounts, was a hardworking woman, great mother. She was simply trying to live her life, work hard, and break off a relationship that she knew was not good for her.
But Jameer Miller had other plans, and on the morning of May 13, 2023, those plans would play out in the most horrific way imaginable. The morning of May 13, 2023 started like any other shift night for Patrice Wilson. She'd worked for overnight shift at Detroit Receiving Hospital, caring for patients through the long, exhausting hours. Around 7:40 to 7:53 in the morning, her shift ended, and she made her way to the employee parking lot, ready to head home to her son. Patrice had no idea that Jameer Miller had been waiting for her, stalking her workplace, preparing for what he was about to do. Surveillance footage and witness accounts would later reveal just how calculated Miller's attack was. Miller had disguised himself with a blonde or red wig, a hat and glasses, attempting to conceal his identity. He'd been lurking in that parking lot for an extended period, waiting specifically for Patrice to emerge from the hospital. When Patrice reached her black 2020 Lincoln Nautilus SUV, Miller made his move. He forced his way into the vehicle, compelling Patrice into the passenger seat or backseat, taking control of her car and her fate in that moment. And what makes this even more heartbreaking is that Patrice was on a phone call when it happened. The person on the other end of that call heard her screams before the line went dead. Imagine the terror of that moment, knowing something horrible was happening to someone you cared about and being completely powerless to stop it. Patrice's mother, Rosalind Livingston, would later share the anguish of learning what happened to her daughter through that phone call, the helplessness of hearing those screams, and then the silence. Miller drove away from the hospital with Patrice in the vehicle, and at some point during or immediately after the abduction, he shot her multiple times, killing her with brutal efficiency. The gunshot wounds were fatal, ending the life of a young mother who simply wanted to break free from a toxic relationship. But Miller wasn't done there. He drove approximately 30 miles northwest to Novi, Michigan, to an apartment complex where he left Patrice's SUV. Her body was in the trunk, hidden away like she was nothing more than an inconvenience, and then Miller disappeared, at least temporarily. The hospital eventually realized something was wrong when Patrice didn't show up for her next shift and couldn't be reached. Her family grew increasingly frantic when calls went unanswered, but it would be nearly 24 hours before the full horror of what happened became clear. On Sunday, May 14, 2023, Mother's Day of all days, Patrice's body was discovered around 2:19 in the afternoon in the trunk of her SUV at that Novi apartment complex. The timing was cruelly ironic because that day meant to celebrate mothers, and instead, Patrice's family was learning that she'd been murdered, that her young son would grow up without her mother. Detroit Police Chief James E. White held a press conference and described the crime as horrific, praising Patrice for doing everything right by ending the relationship, but acknowledging that it hadn't been enough to protect her. But while investigators were processing the crime scene and beginning to piece together what happened, Miller was still out there. He hadn't been arrested yet, and for a brief period, he was a wanted man, his face circulating on social media and news broadcasts across Detroit. Later that same Sunday afternoon, Miller made the decision to turn himself in at the Detroit Detention Center, arriving with his attorney. By this point, with his face everywhere and multiple police departments searching for him, he likely realized he had no other choice. Intensive search warrants had been executed at locations in Inkster, Garden City, and Novi, increasing the pressure on Miller and making it clear that law enforcement was coming for him.
Key news on a murder manhunt. Sources are telling us that the man wanted for kidnapping and killing a 29-year-old nurse has been captured. And that is where we start our news this noon with breaking news. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rhonda Walker. Police say that Jameer Miller kidnapped Patrice Wilson on Saturday from Detroit's receiving hospital's parking lot. Her body was then found the next day. Within the last 30 minutes, we have learned that he is now in custody. Sean Lay got a chance to get that update from investigators. And Sean, I understand you also talked to Patrice's grief-stricken family.
Good afternoon, Rhonda. We're up here on the west side. We just left Patrice Wilson's grandmother's home and mother's home, where they are reacting with so much emotion after this awful roller coaster ride involving their loved one, Patrice Wilson. And they are confirming what we've been able to confirm through sources, that the main suspect here, Jameer Miller, is now in custody. Let me show you some video and break all this down for you, because it all unfolded this weekend as Patrice Wilson, a nurse at Detroit Receiving, simply ending her shift early Saturday morning after 7 a.m. and she was abducted. And immediately Detroit police named her ex-boyfriend, Jameer Miller, as the key suspect. Later that day, Wilson's body was found in her own SUV at her own apartment complex. That happened over in Novi. So that kicked off a long, painstaking manhunt for Jameer Miller that went into Saturday night, all day Sunday, and ended this morning. I just spoke to Patrice Wilson's grandmother, who had this instant reaction about the news today. How did you find out, though?
We got a call this morning saying that they had picked him up, and we're so happy about that. Now we got to go forward. You know, it's still a lot of more questions that need to be asked, but we right now we need to try to get her laid out, and my daughter's kind of really upset right now.
So Patrice Wilson's grandmother is saying, yes, we found out from Detroit police that Miller is in custody. So they're reacting to that. At the same time, Rhonda, planning Wilson's funeral. Just an awful situation here. We're looking into details on how Miller was taken into custody. We're hearing that perhaps he turned himself in at some point this morning. We will get to that. But right now, officially from DPD, we're waiting for a 4 o'clock news conference from DPD. We'll have it covered for you, but we can confirm that Miller now is in custody. That manhunt is over. Back to you.
His surrender didn't change what he'd done. It didn't bring Patrice back, but it did mean that he would face justice for his actions.
I do believe that Mr. Miller is a danger, so there is no bond.
Remanded to jail, no bond given Thursday afternoon for 36-year-old Jameer Miller. We understand that he turned himself in Sunday at the Detroit Detention Center alongside his attorney, and those charges for now are pending. When news spread last weekend that 36-year-old Jameer Miller was wanted in connection to the kidnapping and murder of local nurse Patrice Wilson, it hit differently for this family.
Bianca's family, including their young son, who Miller had been raising alone for 12 years, saw him on television, arrested for murder.
Jameer, the grandson, say, "Ma, Daddy on TV." They was sitting in the living room, and he was watching TV, and he was on the news.
For Bianca's relatives, this arrest meant reopening old wounds and asking new questions.
Chief White very much aware of that case involving Bianca Green. He says they're now working with Romulus police, sharing notes, comparing investigations.
The question hanging in the air was whether Miller had killed before.
In Bianca's case, family always suspected foul play. You know she wouldn't have left Jameer Jr.
She wouldn't have never left Jameer. That was her, like her Velcro. She wouldn't have never left her son.
Bianca's family had always insisted she would never have abandoned her child voluntarily. The idea that she'd just walked away never made sense, and now they desperately hoped for some type of closure after more than a decade. On June 1st, 2023, Wayne County prosecutor Kim Worthy announced formal charges against Jameer Miller. The list was extensive: 1 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of felony murder, 1 count of carjacking, 1 count of armed robbery, 1 count of felon in possession of a firearm, and 5 counts of felony firearm. These charges carried the potential for life in prison without parole.
It was a woman that had a relationship with a man that she was trying to get out of. It was a woman that was hardworking, was simply leaving her job that day to get home to her family.
Prosecutor Worthy spoke passionately about Patrice's case, emphasizing that this was a hard-working woman who was simply trying to get home to her family after work. She highlighted how dangerous it is for domestic violence victims when they try to leave abusive relationships.
Worthy says that is the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims.
It was a man that allegedly would not leave her alone, would not respond to her wishes to leave her alone.
But as the case moved forward, Miller's defense attorneys began negotiating a plea deal, and in October of 2023, Miller accepted the deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange for his guilty plea, the prosecution agreed to dismiss the other charges. Patrice's family supported this decision because it meant they wouldn't have to sit through a full trial, wouldn't have to hear every graphic detail of how she died, or have to relive the trauma in a courtroom.
She knows it won't bring her beloved daughter back, but at the very least, she gets some closure. The man charged with kidnapping and murdering a Detroit nurse admits he did it.
The plea deal provided certainty and allowed them to move toward closure. The sentencing hearing took place on November 7, 2023, and it was emotionally charged. Family members delivered victim impact statements, looking Miller in the eye and telling him exactly what he'd taken from them. Patrice's grandmother, Pamela Golden, delivered one of the most powerful statements, her voice shaking with rage and grief as she condemned Miller with the devastating words, "You ain't fit to live." She wasn't just speaking for herself, but for everyone who loved Patrice, for the 7-year-old boy who would grow up without his mother. Miller, through his attorney, read a letter expressing remorse. He acknowledged that he had failed Patrice and their families, but whatever regret he claims to feel couldn't undo what he'd done.
I can read it for him. I read it for him? That's fine. I sit up every night, every day, every night, trying to figure out what to say. Beating myself up because I know that there is nothing I can say to make things okay. Nothing to say to make this reverse. Nothing to say to heal our families. This has been the worst, most haunting experience of my life.
Judge Kevin Cox sentenced Miller to 35 to 60 years in prison. Prosecutor Worthy called the sentence appropriate for the senseless, violent act he'd committed. Miller is currently incarcerated at Chippewa Correctional Facility, and his earliest possible release date is May 13, 2058, which would make him 71 years old. In all likelihood, Miller will spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the story doesn't end with Miller's conviction. Patrice's family had more questions about how this tragedy could have been prevented.
And our position is that had they done what they were supposed to do, she might still be alive.
On August 1st, 2023, what would have been Patrice's 30th birthday, her family filed a massive $200 million lawsuit against the Detroit Medical Center and its parent company, Tenet Healthcare. The family claimed that the hospital had been negligent. No security patrols in the parking lot, non-functioning surveillance cameras, failure to activate active shooter protocols even after an eyewitness nurse reported hearing gunshots, a delay of 2 to 4 hours before police were notified, and no facility lockdown.
We feel that had she been one of those white nurses down there, they would have announced it immediately, and maybe the young lady would still be alive.
The family also alleged racial motivations in the hospital's slow response, suggesting that there was a pattern of discrimination and that if Patrice had been white, the response might have been faster.
Fighting tears, she says she's the reason why Patrice took that job in the first place.
Patrice's mother, Rosalind, who also worked for the Detroit Medical Center, expressed heartbreak over the fact that she was the one who'd encouraged Patrice to take that job.
They didn't keep her safe. And it's heartbreaking to know that DMC didn't keep her safe.
We received a statement from DMC in regards to this lawsuit. It says in part, the DMC stands behind our security team who acted swiftly to notify and engage local law enforcement to apprehend the assailant.
Detroit Medical Center emphasized their continued cooperation with prosecutors and their commitment to maintaining a safe workplace, but they refused to comment specifically on the pending litigation. As of today, no public resolution to this lawsuit has been reported. And meanwhile, Bianca Green's disappearance remains unsolved. Despite the renewed investigation, no new evidence has been uncovered and no charges have been filed. But Patrice's legacy extends beyond tragedy. Her organs were donated after she died, saving multiple lives. And in May of 2025, the Patrice Wilson Scholarship was established by the organization Nursing from the D, supporting nursing students who are mothers. Detroit Police Chief White noted that domestic violence homicides are on the rise, with 12 people in Detroit alone being classified as domestic violence-related homicide victims.
A well-known Oakland County employee died in a domestic murder situation. Now this seems like this is an issue that just is getting worse in many ways.
That is exactly what the chief said earlier today. He said they are seeing a rise in domestic violence. Here in Detroit alone, 12 people victims of homicide, and the chief is classifying those as domestic violence related.
Patrice Wilson's story is a reminder that we need better protections for domestic violence victims, better security measures at workplaces, and a justice system that takes threats seriously before they escalate. While Jamir Miller will spend the rest of his life in prison, that punishment can never truly balance the scales of what was lost. What do you think about this case? Let me know in the comments section, and also click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.